Chapter 12. How long do you think it will take for us to get to New York? I know I sprung this on you at the last minute, but I'm in a hurry. And thank you for being so kind as to drive me there, Hannah said, glancing over at the young blonde man with a serious gaze in his eyes. She turned, taking in a relieved breath. She needed to get home. Once there, she could feel more like herself. Since being with Jovani, she couldn't think. Now her thoughts became clear. The young man with the tranquil, solemn look never took his eyes off the road, maybe a day at most. If I keep driving, and the weather isn't bad and I get to the interstate soon, and with us stopping for gas, yeah, a day and night is all it'll take. He smiled as if he was in a trance or on something. Maybe meds. That would account for him being so peaceful and accommodating, Hannah thought. I can drive if you need me to. He gave Hannah a small, closed smile, as if he thought driving wasn't for females. I don't think that will be necessary. I enjoy driving. It calms me and I can think better, he said, turning to her for a second. Then resuming his focus on the rutted road ahead. Why are you in a hurry, if you don't mind me asking? The young man questioned. My parents think I'm dead, and I'm sure they've contacted the police. The authorities must have found the plane wreckage by now. Justin Samsa brought me out here to protect me. Protect you from what? Hannah wouldn't answer with the truth. She had said all that was necessary to the young man and didn't want to alarm him with tales of witches and a female vampire who's looking to kill her, and maybe anyone in her presence. As long as he dropped her home and headed back, he shouldn't be in any trouble from them. It's nothing. He wanted to give me time to make up my mind about him or this other guy, she said, turning to him and then withdrawing back into herself. Into her secret. You know the Samas are a pack of. He hit his forehead lightly with his rolled-up fist as if he was trying to remember, and lost his thought like an elderly man. I mean, they're a great family. You would do much worse if you didn't choose him. But he didn't know that Hannah had made her choice, and there wasn't any turning back. I made a choice, she said, looking ahead. The blonde man never reacted to that news. He focused on the road, and as the Jeep bumped over rough roads with deep potholes and gravel. Hannah wore a seatbelt, but still she felt as if she had been thrown around by a roller coaster ride at a fair. Since we're going to be together for hours, don't you think we should introduce ourselves? My name is Hannah. I'm Dan. He smiled, taking his eyes off the road for a second to shake Hannah's hand, and bang. The bump was hard and large enough to startle Hannah. Dan's Jeep had hit something in the road. It jarred the car and sent it careening into a ditch before it stopped. He glanced over to Hannah. Are you okay? Did you see anything? He narrowed his eyes. It felt as if I hit something in the road. I'd better get out and check. I'm fine. Got my seatbelt on, and no, I didn't see anything. But it must have been a large animal. It felt like you ran over it. See, there are signs, watch out for deer. She pointed to the large sign across the two-lane farm road. Dan opened his door and stepped into the muddy ground and gazed into the morning sunrise bouncing off the hood of the car. I don't see any blood. Must have been a boulder of some kind. He shrugged and huffed out a small breath and walked around to see if there was damage done to the Jeep. Giving the Jeep a loving pat, Dan said, looking at Hannah through her window, I love this old Jeep. It never fails me. I'll have it out of here in a minute. And he clambered back into the car, buckled up and started the Jeep, angled it to the blacktop road, and headed east again. They hadn't driven a mile when they spotted someone standing in the middle of the road. You can't stop, Hannah said. You don't know what that is. She touched the wheel, and Dan glanced over at her, and she took her hand off it. She knew it was dangerous being a front seat driver. It's a man, Dan said as they neared the vision. As they came closer, the sight of a man wearing black came into focus. Dan hadn't slowed the car, and the man never moved to the side. He stood in the middle of the road. Hannah glanced over to the side and saw a large house at a distance. Why was the man standing there, came to Hannah's mind. All the more important that we don't pick up strangers. Just go around him. But Dan didn't listen. He was a soldier. Maybe he thought about how he had been lost from his platoon, and Lycell came across him and vowed to return, and he did. He wasn't left behind that day, and he wouldn't leave anyone behind he had promised himself. But that was in time of war. But Dan didn't know the difference. He brought the car to a screeching stop in front of the stranger, and the stranger never panicked, but walked around glaring at Hannah and climbed into the back seat as if it was natural to be in the middle of nowhere and had expected someone to come along and rescue him. "What are you doing here this early in the morning?" Dan asked the man dressed in a long black duster of a coat with a hood on it. And under the black duster he wore a black shirt, black pants and black boots. When he sat back he pushed the hood back, and Hannah turned to get a look at him. Dan watched him from his mirror, and when he did, he felt that Hannah had been right. He should never have picked him up. He didn't know what it was about the stranger, but he saw something in his face. In his black eyes. The face of a predator. Dark bloodshot eyes with no expression. The stranger's face gaunt and tired looking. His dark hair dry as straw, and he over 6 feet bone thin. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His eyes sunken and piercing. The way he stared at Dan and then Hannah made Dan nervous. And Dan hadn't been nervous in years since he had been committed to the VA hospital, and since his return to civilian life. "Where can we drop you?" Dan asked as if he was ready to push him out of the car any time. But something in him wouldn't allow him to do so. He didn't want to prejudge the man. He could have an innocent excuse for being in the middle of the road, early in the morning. "Off the road a bit. It's not far. Maybe a half a mile down the road," the stranger said, barely opening his mouth with a face that didn't move, as if it was mummified and stretched over a skeleton. Hannah glanced over at Dan and said, "Can't we stay on the road and let him get out and walk the rest of the way? I don't feel good about him," she leaned and whispered to Dan. But the dark stranger reacted as if he heard every word. "Don't worry, you're coming up to the turn. Make a right, and it's a few steps behind those trees," the stranger said. Dan turned right with Hannah holding onto Dan's leg. Dan looked down because her hand clutched him so tight he felt her nails dig into the material of the tough jeans. "I thought you said it was a few paces," Hannah said to the man. "I could have been wrong. Just keep driving, we'll get there soon." He spoke as if he was now in control. Dan continued down the dusty road, and then he saw where the man was going. It was a large house that resembled a plantation home with several huts nearby. The small houses had been neglected years ago, but the main plantation home stood stately, as if it had just been built or painted with white paint to give a lived-in appearance. White columns held the front of the porch and anchored the house. But it didn't give the impression that anyone was there to take care of it. Hannah let out a breath of relief. They could go on their way now. "Why don't you get down? I'd like to pay you for your time," he said in a southern drawl. Hannah thought that was strange because before there was no sign of a southern accent when he spoke. "We have to get going," Dan said. "There's no need to pay us for anything." Hannah's eyes shot to Dan and he returned the glance. There was no way Dan would get out of that car, and neither would Hannah. Nothing rang true about the stranger. Everything appeared staged, including the large mansion setting back in the wooded area, with not a soul around. There was a barn but no livestock. There were chicken coops but no chickens. The silence in the clearing where the house stood said it all. There wasn't anything alive except the three of them, and Dan and Hannah knew that it was true of two, but they weren't sure of the stranger who didn't appear to be going anywhere. An uncomfortable silence reigned among them until the stranger made an attempt to step out of the car, and then leaned forward, and as quick as Hannah could open her mouth to call Dan, the stranger had stabbed Dan in the base of the skull with some kind of silver-colored spike. It was an ice pick. The kind people used years ago when there were no refrigerators and men brought large blocks of ice to your home, and the only way to break the ice was to use an ice pick. Hannah couldn't scream. All she could do was place her hands over her mouth. One over the other. Her eyes opened wide along with her mouth, and she huffed out sounds into her hands over and over. Then she stopped and tried to scream. When she did try, nothing came out. She sat in horror as Dan slumped forward over the steering wheel, and his head stayed that way. The blood streamed down his back and to the right side of his shoulder, and pooled on the space between Hannah and him. Now, Hannah, will you get out? Or do I have to carry you out? How do you know my name? Hannah sat petrified with her hand to her mouth, trying to bite her nails. Let's say I know your name. It's my job to deliver you here without hurting you, but I will if I have to. Now get out. His voice low but with an extreme tone. Hannah sat a moment stunned, looking at Dan. She didn't know him, but she liked him. How could this happen to such a kind soul? How could this happen to her? Before I get out, tell me who wants me here. I don't know anyone in this area who would kill a person just to get to me. Well, I know many who would kill to get you. You will find out later. It's just my job to bring you here, not answer your questions or kill you. That you will have to take up with my master. She's oversees everything, and now for the last time, get out of the car. He stepped out after Hannah unfastened her seatbelt and swung open the car door. For a moment she looked around, and then without thought she began running in the direction of the woods. She headed for the tall pines and the high grass, thinking she was in better shape than the tall, emaciated bones of a man. She was to some extent, but it didn't matter. She rushed along, looking back and not ahead. She rushed into what felt like a brick wall. When she turned to look, it was a woman standing in front of her. The woman wore a youthful face, but under that face an old face of over 100 years. She stood thin and youthful as if her body was from another time. But her clothes were of this time, only they were black. She wore a black cold shoulder sweater and a pair of designer pants, followed by black high-heeled boots. Where are you going, Hannah? Don't you know you can't run from us? She said with a bright, wide smile showing a full, beautiful mouth of white teeth. What is going on? Your caretaker killed my friend. I know all about that, the woman said in a patronizing tone. What's one lost soul compared to all the ones in the universe? He was just an inconvenience to me, and if you persist in running away, I will let Sasha have you. His voice changed from that of cheerful to cold and hard. Sasha made you a present to me to do as I please, but you're proving to be problematic, she said, passing her hand over Hannah's curls and Hannah withdrawing in disgust. I don't like problems, I like order. You have a choice. I could use you, and therefore you may have a few nights to live, or I could turn you over to Sasha, in which case she will torture you, give you to her army of undead, and they will suck you dry where you will live in agony for years until you die. Which will it be? Hannah stared defiantly at the witch without a word. Very well, she said in a satisfied tone as she reached for Hannah's wrists. Hannah bit her hand, and the witch smiled. Defiant, I see. You will lose that soon. And Tycia wrapped a rope around Hannah's wrists and led her past the caretaker. She heard the witch say to the caretaker as he recoiled in fear. She said to him, I'll deal with you later.